tare tu re. Mangalam Shri Mahapani Swaha. Om tare tu re. Mangalam Shri Mahapani Swaha. Om tare tu re. Mangalam Shri Mahapani Swaha. Om tare tu re. Mangalam Shri Mahapani Swaha.
Hello and welcome everyone to the Lama Life livestream event of Lama Tsultrim, Allione. My name is Dreame and I'm delighted to be your host for this gathering, joining you all the way from Poland. We are very fortunate to have two special guests with us today, Erik Jampa Andersson and Anna Raithel, to discuss the exciting release of Erik's highly anticipated book, Unseen Beings, How We Forgot the World is More Than Human, which is a revolutionary perspective on the climate crisis, which delves into history, philosophy, science, and religion to explore how and why we became a human-centric world and what this means for the environment. Let me now briefly introduce our guests today. Erik Jampa Andersson, founder and director of Srimala, a Tibetan medicine clinic, is a London-based practitioner, teacher, and scholar of Tibetan Buddhism and Tibetan medicine. He is a graduate of the Shangshung Institute School of Tibetan Medicine and is currently completing an MA in history at Goldsmiths University. Anna Raithel completed her BA in religion and then lived at Taramandala for 6 years, working as Lama Tsultrim's executive assistant and the temple manager. She studied Tibetan language and Gyaling, coordinated the annual Drupchans, and was the lead Umdzei, chant leader, and Chöpen, ritual arts leader. Anna recently finished her MBA with a focus on sustainable development. She now lives in Portland, Oregon. And just this week, Anna has been appointed by Lama Tsultrim Allione as lead Chöpen of Taramandala. So without further ado, I now invite Lama Tsultrim Allione to grace us with her opening remarks, followed by the captivating interview between Erik Jampa and Anna Raithel. Enjoy.
Good morning, everyone, and lots of love to you wherever you are. Let's take a moment to raise bodhicitta, the intention to be together for the benefit of all beings today. Just a moment of heartfelt generation. So this is really the raising of a thought toward enlightenment for the benefit of all beings. Thank you. I always think about the moment when I met Jampa, who was 14 years old at the time, and he was walking across the field at Taramandala. It was before we had any buildings there. And it was down near the old garden. And I was in the old bookstore, which was in a yurt, which always had lots of mice and various other friends in the bookstore that we always had to be protecting the books from. But for some reason that day I was there, and I really was very rarely there. It was before we lived out by the land. And it wasn't during the summer. It was like in the fall or the spring or sometime that wasn't a time when we were having retreats. And I just happened to be there. And I see this young man walking toward me across the field. And then he comes up to me and he says, "Tashi Dere, I'm Nyingma." And I was like, how does this basically, like a child, know Tashi Dere and know Nyingma, which is a very specific sect of Tibetan Buddhism that he had discovered basically on the internet. He'd figured out who he was basically at the age of 14. And that's how he is. He's always known who he is, and he's been doing it for his whole life, basically. And so this book is really the product of many years of preparation and study, and combining his love of nature, his knowledge of Tibetan medicine, and also his knowledge of the Dharma and his sensitivity to what's happening now, and offering a proper and possible solution for what's happening, at least an aspect of a solution. Because I think it's important to understand not only how bad the problem is, but also what we can do so we don't just feel hopeless. So yeah, so he continued connecting with Taramandala, and then eventually came to live on the land in the summers. And during that time, he met Anna. Anna came to live on the land in the summer of 2007, and she had done a study abroad program in India at the time, in Bodh Gaya, actually, that Antioch has. And so she had some idea about Tibetan Buddhism. She was very, very enthusiastic and just wanted to learn and do everything. And she did, essentially. And then she and I got quite close because after David died, she traveled with me. And of course, that was a very, very difficult time in my life. And Anna was just always with me. And we traveled all over the world, to Asia, to Europe several times, and Asia several times. And we were just always together. And then when we began the Drupchen in 2009, she was actually living at Taramandala at that time. And so she got trained from the beginning by Khenpo Urgyen, as did Erik Jampa as well. And he's from Bhutan, and he was sent by Tulku Sanak Rinpoche to help us learn the ritual arts and then produce a Drupchen, which is kind of like the grand opera of Vajrayana, I guess you could say. Is a huge thing. It's a 10-day ceremony that goes day and night, that never stops. And there's a lot of ritual in it. There's dances every night, ritual dances, and there's practices all day, and then the mantra recitation during the small hours of the night. So they were both there together and became close friends. And so Anna now is head Chupan, which is the person that runs between, and run I think is actually a good word because they're often running between the Lama and the shrine, and then the sort of backstage where things are being made and produced for these various rituals. And so Anna's now head Chupan of Taramandala, which means she'll be training the newer Chupans and also sharing her knowledge and her leadership during ceremonies that we have. So this just happened. I mean, she's really been basically in that position for a long time, but I decided to make it more official just recently. And this just happens to be happening at that time when this just happened. So I want to congratulate Anna, and then just welcome you both, and just say to Erik how proud I am of you. It hasn't been easy. His journey in life was challenging, especially in his younger years, and sort of finding his way. Now he's settled, he's married, he always wanted to live in Europe, and he's married to an Italian. And so he's good, he's on his way. But I think for all of us, it's always a little difficult in the beginning to figure out exactly how you're going to go and where you're going to go when you're young. So this book is really the fruition of now he's settled and now he's able to really focus on these things. And he actually wrote this book really fast and it's really good. So I have a copy here. Journeys. Oops, sorry, that's the wrong book. Anyway, it's called Unseen Beings. And it's a really amazing book. And so I think that all of you will enjoy the book and really encourage you to get it. And he'll be doing other events online that Dreame will announce and give you all the information for. And so without further ado, I just want to, with great love and pride, introduce you, Erik Jampa, and thank you very much, Anna Raithel, for doing this, and excited to hear it. Lots of love.
Oh, that was such a great intro. Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. Love being here with you, Erik Jampa. It's very fun to think back of how much time has passed since we met and all the different phases of our life that we've lived.
Totally.
And so actually, I think it's a great place to start with like all of your background with being the lead Umze to my lead Chupiting and your Chud scholarship, Tolkien scholarship, Tibetan medicine, your practice, master's in history. And so bringing all of this experience together, what was the genesis of this book? Like why this book and why this time?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. It is, it's all of those things. It really, people will see when you read the book, just even when you just flip through it, each chapter sort of pulls from a different area, a different field that I've been enchanted by and engaged with and immersed in over the course of my life, especially the past, 20 years, but really beyond that quite a bit. I've always been a bit of a seeker by nature. Since I was really young, I was very interested in very strange things. That was pretty consistent throughout my childhood and my adult life. Getting really into sort of occult topics when I was very young, summoning beings of various kinds at like 7 years old and doing tarot readings and studying astrology and I Ching and all of those kinds of things. I was very interested in ghosts and a series of traumatic experiences as a child, especially the loss of my brother, who was killed when I was 8-9 years old. That really impacted me quite a bit as well, and I think put my mind into more existential kinds of matters. And right around that time, not so long thereafter, my mother gave me a copy of The Hobbit, and I was reluctant at first to read it because the name sounded very silly. But I read it and became unbelievably captivated by Tolkien's work. I read everything that he wrote, spent years and years of my life really studying Tolkien. I still study him today. I have my Tolkien books all around me. But that was, I think, in a lot of ways, the kind of entryway into a real experience of enchantment that led me into the sort of forest, so to speak. It led me into the wild, into the land of Faerie, the sort of enchanted domain, an enchanted way of looking at the world. And that deeply inspired me and then compelled me to want to find other systems and traditions that could provide some sort of a piece of that experience of enchantment, something that at that time especially I could sink my teeth into as something that was more real, more legitimate and sort of authentic as a tradition that you can follow. So I started looking at many different religions. I was attending a Christian school at the time. I was raised sort of nominally Christian, but I was never really interested in it. And I shopped around a bit. I looked at a lot of different, texts and books and teachers and various traditions. And Buddhism is ultimately what really, grasped me. That's what made the most sense to me. It's what felt like home. It's what felt really familiar and deeply accessible. It spoke to me on a deep level. And I was sort of, experimenting with meditation, reading books on Zen meditation, especially for about a year, and then I discovered Tibetan Buddhism, and there were a couple of books that really sort of just changed my world, and I decided pretty quickly that I wanted to be a Nyingmapa. I wanted to follow the Nyingma tradition. Also, that I was really interested in Chud. There's a book, Tibetan Buddhist Life by Don Farber, which is a photo book, gorgeous photos by Don. But the Nyingma page shows a few practitioners with their chud drums doing chud. So that page sort of introduced me to the concept of the Nyingma tradition, Guru Rinpoche, the chud practice, and that as soon as I saw that, there was the sense that, this is really what I'm supposed to do. I read other books to get some more context regarding it, but that was what I wanted my path to be. And I was very fortunate to meet my Lama, a year after discovering Buddhism, after deciding that this was my lineage, and then discovering that she was a teacher in this lineage, this intersection of lineages that I really, was drawn to. And yeah, it just sort of worked out. I found that, in my time at Taramandala, once I started spending summers there and really, deepening my engagement and experiencing, actually being there and being in community there, the entire rest of my life just kind of changed. I was an actor for a long time, and I decided that I wanted to leave that and go into Tibetan studies more academically and formally. And then I went to Naropa and then left that to do Tibetan medicine school because I wanted something that felt a little bit more traditional. I wanted to really step into it and experience, one of these grand systems of knowledge within the Tibetan tradition in a really authentic way. So Tibetan medicine gave me sort of the space to do that. But as far as what led me to write the book, I've always wanted to write a book. I've written a number of textbooks because I teach on Tibetan medicine and various topics. But I wanted to, try my hand at writing something like this. But I didn't anticipate that this would be the result. When I first pitched this to a publisher a few years ago, they actually approached me about it. They wanted a book on Tibetan medicine, which then after the pandemic hit sort of, transitioned a bit into a Tibetan medical approach to the pandemic. And I was really interested in speaking about provocation disorders in Tibetan medicine, which are diseases that are caused by unseen beings. That's where the name originally came from. But then as I started researching and writing, I found that all of these different streams were coming together, and I became confronted with this question of why do we perceive the world as human-centered, but specifically so differently from how we know it actually is. Even when, early conversations were going on, or throughout the entirety of sort of the bulk of the COVID pandemic, there were all kinds of conversations about, so many different aspects of it, but very few looking at the environmental components of it, or looking seriously at the ways that our relationships with the natural world, the so-called natural world, and with non-human beings are themselves implicated in the outbreak of zoonotic infections, which we know are on the rise as a result of climate change. And it was that component of really just ignoring the role, the agency, the involvement of non-human beings and our relationship with nature that pushed me to ask some sort of different questions. The book itself, the subtitle is How We Forgot the World is More Than Human. And that ended up really being the point. I wanted to try to explain as best as I could from the various, systems and traditions that I've studied and fields of research that I'm engaged with, how we got to this point, why so many people today genuinely believe or feel that we are in a human-centered world, that we humans are the most important beings in the universe. People ask questions like there was an article in the Scientific American last August about searching for extraterrestrial life. And in the opening paragraph, the author writes, I think this is verbatim, given the evidence, it would seem impossible that human beings would be the only living things in the cosmos. And I read that. And it's one of those things you read it once and you're like, oh, that's probably right. There's probably aliens out there. But then you look at it again, wait, the only living things in the cosmos? I'm not even the only living thing in this room. It's absolutely unconscionable that we could think of our world in that way. And yet we do. So I really, I wanted to to deal with that question. The unseen beings, there are spirits in this. I study spirits a lot. That's a big part of what my master's is dedicated to, the ways that nature spirit paradigms impact our perceptions of ecology and our place in the world and so on. But really, the unseen beings are not invisible. They're the beings that we don't see as beings. You know, they're the beings in our midst who are entirely visible. We can look right at them. You can stare at a cockroach. You can stare at your cat. You can stare at a tree. You can stare at a daffodil and never recognize on a deep level that there is a living being, a conscious, sentient being looking back at you, that there's a meeting of minds in that moment. So that's really, they're the unseen beings. They're the really important unseen beings. And us disregarding them is a really significant component of our climate crisis that I don't think we talk about enough.
Yeah, it's as I'm listening to you, it seems so obvious. Like, we're like, of course we are one species in a whole planet. Of course, like, we love our pets, and we have these relationships to other beings, and yet humans tend to center themselves in the narrative. And this is one of the things that I've just like love to pay attention to as I read the news or read articles about things, is that we recognize only other forms of intelligence that are similar to humans as intelligent.
Totally.
And it's such a strange concept when you start really digging into it, of like, we only think something is important when we recognize ourselves in it.
Totally. Even artificial intelligence. I mean, that's like, it's been really interesting to see this conversation, because it really feels like for a lot of people, it's easier to perceive of artificial intelligence as potentially sentient than it is to perceive of a mouse or a bird or a worm or a tree or a mushroom as potentially sentient. And that's profoundly concerning, because those latter beings are literally our relatives. They are literally our cousins. There isn't a living thing on this planet who isn't a part of our biological family, unless you potentially count viruses, because we don't really know how or if we're related to them. But
because we don't understand them.
Because we don't understand them, and therefore we can't even necessarily perceive them as life. They're sort of these beings on the peripheries of life. But you are cousins with the gut bacteria that live inside your body. That those beings help to comprise our humanness, but also they are beings themselves that we are related to. If we were to trace our lineage, our ancestral lineage back, and imagine all of your ancestors, the vast majority of those beings are not humans. The vast majority of our forebears, those who came before us and who literally birthed us into existence, they're not humans. So our perception of our place in the world is really quite weird. It's weird. It's unusual in that it is enigmatic. It is not the norm across human societies. The vast majority of human cultures, for the vast majority of human history, have not perceived of an anthropocentric world. They have not perceived that human beings are the only sentient creatures in the world, and they haven't viewed themselves as being in a position of sort of sovereignty or dominance over all other forms of life. That has been the norm for us to view it the other way. Our approach is very enigmatic. It has a very specific lineage. It's a very specific kind of story. It doesn't arise from science. It doesn't arise from the scientific method or empiricism of any kind. It arises from really antiquated philosophical traditions, which were first established as philosophical musings and then integrated into religious traditions and then reified at the dawn of modernity to really establish the modern world as we know it. But they're antiquated nonsense myths in the most pejorative sense that we really have to deconstruct and be willing to let go of. Because if we don't, then the Anthropocene will be the last epoch that in which humans will live on this earth. And that's not even the greatest tragedy. It's not just our lives that are at stake. There are countless lives, countless species, countless ecological communities and societies, that entire ways of living and looking at the world that are at stake. We're all facing cataclysm, and we can do something about it, but we need to be willing to change the way we see the world.
Yeah, I think at this point, it feels like most people are aware of the ecological crisis, of the climate crisis. But if you could explain, so you just touched on the Anthropocene, and this is, of course, a huge driving underlying thesis of your book of how the Anthropocene contributed to our separation from nature, this view that humans are separate from nature. And so you just described really the overview of what your book is, of how you go back and look at this relationship through all these different lenses, through the Western lens, Asian lens, religion. But if you could describe, specifically for our viewers, what the Anthropocene is, and how this happened, this split between human and nature, and like how these forms of thinking developed.
Yeah, so the Anthropocene is very interesting. It's in the news a lot right now because there's a lot of teams of researchers, geologists specifically, who are trying to really pinpoint what can be termed the golden spike of the Anthropocene, the sort of starting point of the Anthropocene, when we actually transition from the Holocene, which was the previous epoch, into a new one. And this is a geological affair because epochs are themselves determined by the fossil record. So significant shifts in the fossil record indicate significant shifts in epoch. This is, our concept, but it's based in geological science. The Anthropocene is essentially, it was first sort of formally introduced in 2000, but it was spoken about in the 80s by Eugene Sturmer, and then Paul Crutzen and Eugene Sturmer really brought it to sort of public awareness in 2000 as the epoch of humans, the the human scene epoch. So their proposal is essentially that once upon a time, humans didn't have a very significant impact on our world. We didn't have a big impact on the environment. Sort of natural history, the history of the geological history and natural history was separate from human history, that there was a kind of divide between human culture and non-human nature. But then at some point in the past 500 years, either 500 years ago, 200 years ago, or about 70 years ago, that changed. And because of human development, because of industry, because of colonization, because of a sort of mix of these circumstances, we started exerting greater agency and more of an impact on the world, and have thus changed the planet in the process. The idea is that we have evolved from mere beings, a mere species, to geological agents. And along with this narrative comes, and it is a narrative. I'm not saying that this needs to be deconstructed critically, and I do a bit in the book, but there's a lot of works trying to do this. But one of the assumptions is that this was a mistake, or it was an accident, sorry, not a mistake, but that it was an accident, that we didn't mean to cause these sorts of problems, that it just kind of happened. There's an idea that it can be turned into a force for good, because if we just use our agency to double down on our dynamics of control, that we can get things in order and make the world a perfect sort of utopia. Now, there's also, along with this argument, the concept of the Anthropocene indicates that all humans are ultimately to blame. And this is a very clever depoliticizing tool by those that use this narrative without criticizing it, because this simply isn't true. The idea that all humans are one collective, undifferentiated anthropos, and that it's our human nature to destroy the environment is profoundly short-sighted, quite Eurocentric, quite modernist, and it really just completely ignores the fact that, again, the vast majority of humans' cultures throughout history have not lived this way. And even today, there are many cultures and societies in the world who do not live this way. So there's a lot wrong with this narrative for a lot of reasons. And there's various researchers and theorists that have proposed alternatives, saying instead of Anthropocene, we'll call it the Petrocene, or the Androcene, or the Eurocene, or the Pleistocene, not the Pleistocene, the plastic.
I think that already exists as something.
Yeah, no, exactly. The plastic scene, or even the Cthulhu scene. There's a lot of different ideas. But there's other conversations being had here about the causation. When does it really begin? The way that I approach the Anthropocene in Unseen Beings is I approach it as a chronic disease. It is a disease that has very ancient roots. It has some prehistoric roots, going back to, for instance, the dawn of the use of agriculture, especially animal agriculture. But that there's more recent ancient roots, very specifically in the ancient Greek world and classical philosophies of Plato and Aristotle, also in the rise of Christianity and then later Islam, these global religions, which are really centered around, in large part, anthropocentrism and an anthropocentric cosmos. And then, later on, through dynamics of colonization, through the rise of modern philosophers like Rene Descartes, there's a lot of aspects, the rise of modern science and the ways that we break up the world. It's been a long trajectory. It's been a long process, just like a chronic disease. If you look at someone who has like alcohol-related liver disease, how do you establish when that disease really began? Do you look at the marker, like finding the golden spike in the geological record, and you say, well, this is when the liver tests came back abnormal, so this was the beginning of the disease? Or do you say, well, it's actually when they started drinking all day every day, it's when alcoholism became a problem? And then you say, okay, well, actually maybe it was the first time that they started drinking for comfort and for a relief of suffering. Or okay, well, maybe if we go beyond that, then maybe it was the trauma, maybe it was the traumatic incidents potentially in childhood that led them then to start drinking. And then okay, well, maybe it's their parents' trauma which then rolled downhill. It's very difficult to establish a starting point for something like this because there's so many causes and conditions. This is one of the reasons that Tibetan medicine is very useful. Medicine in general is very useful for looking at this, because you have to really consider those many causes and conditions, comorbidities, the general path of progression, and then you can actually deal with what it is more directly. So yeah, that's sort of how I approach the Anthropocene. I consider the Anthropocene to be a chronic disease which is rooted in anthropocentrism. And really the only reason that I'm comfortable with the use of the term Anthropocene, given the fact that it tends to really just completely ignore the existence of indigenous peoples and any non-Western, non- or pre-modern societies, is because you can see this link between the Anthropocene and anthropocentrism, the concept of the human, the very idea that there was ever a separation between human culture and non-human nature is utterly preposterous. So many of the arguments made by the Anthropocene narrative are not true. We have always impacted the land around us. We have always impacted the earth. We have constantly terraformed the earth. The process of European colonization specifically was intended to change the climate. The America that exists today did not exist 600 years ago. It was a completely different place. Ecologically, it was an entirely different place. The populations that lived there, obviously entirely different, but not just humans, also the entirety of the flora and fauna. There are so many aspects of what became the Neo-Europes that are now no longer, because Europeans colonized and terraformed those places with the intent of changing the climate. And this is at the heart of our concept of what it means to be human in the modern world, this idea of progress in the sense of taking nature, taking base sort of, things as they are, and then improving upon them, making them better, increasing our own dominance, our own control over the world around us. That mentality, the pursuit of dominance, the pursuit of superiority, and the exclusion of all other beings in that process, that's why we're in this mess. And we're not actually going to fix the climate crisis any more than we're going to fix any of the other social and cultural and political issues that we're facing if we can't deal with the root cause. We have to go beyond, putting a bandage on it. Even focusing exclusively on fossil fuels and, carbon emissions, it's important that we deal with those, but simply finding a limitless source of clean energy isn't gonna fix it. We will use that limitless source of clean energy to continue exploiting and dominating all other beings that we deem to be others. And that needs to be dealt with first and foremost.
Yeah, I'm very much appreciating the depth of momentum behind this current crisis. And when I say crisis, I mean environmental, human health, social justice. As I'm listening to you, I can think of so many things that are happening now that you can trace their roots back to what you're talking about. These hundreds of years of humans thinking that we're saying, centering themselves in the narrative and then constructing the world around them to suit those needs. And I'm really appreciating the depth and where does it start? How do you go back to that root cause? How do you even identify it?
Yeah.
And is that even the point? Is the point maybe to identify the root cause, but then to start unraveling the pathway? Like what do we do?
Yeah, exactly. I think it is really important to recognize, and I talk about this in the book, but there's a paradigm underlying a lot of the really oppressive systems that we've created in our societies. And this is what Val Plumwood calls a master identity complex. And there's a sort of preceding piece to that, which is the obsession with taxonomy, the obsession with breaking the world up and its beings up into neat little categories. And that's been going on for a very long time. But this mentality, if you strip everything back and you just think about the basic model that the nature of the world is such that you can divide everyone up into little categories on some basis, whether it's the basis of their sex, their species, the color of their skin, their gender identity, their sexual behaviors, their ethnicity, their religion, any of those things. You can break them up into these categories, and then you'll know a lot about them by looking at one little feature of who they are. And then once you have your categories neat and tidy, then you can arrange that into a hierarchy. There's someone at the top, which is the master identity, and then everyone else is arrayed below them as being inferior and potentially subservient to that master identity. And this is what happens with speciesism and anthropocentrism. This is what happens with racism and white supremacy. This is what happens with sexism and androcentrism, the centrality of men in society. All of these kinds of models share the same framework. They share the same basic ideology. And our approach to nature, so-called nature, which I try to deconstruct this term also a little bit in the book as well, but our whole conception of the more than human world is very much uncritically bound by this mentality. We don't ask a lot of questions about it. It's not really on vogue just yet. It is becoming so, but it hasn't been historically to really look at this critically and to question whether the systems and institutions that we've created have fallen into these very blind and destructive biases and prejudices, which privilege a certain point of view above all others for no good reason. So I think it's important to understand that, and to understand specifically when it comes to climate change and environmental desecration and the so-called Anthropocene. We need to understand how anthropocentrism and its roots have created this system so that we can deconstruct that and we can understand, okay, that's where it comes from. I don't actually need to believe the scribbled lecture notes that Aristotle never intended for anyone else to see. I don't need to believe this ideology, which was popularized in these massive patriarchal religious institutions for the purpose of oppressing and dominating all other forms of life. I don't need to believe that. So that's, a good first step, to recognize that's the cause and that we don't have to be bound to that. And then we have some work to do. Deconstruction is not a passive process. Deconstruction is very active, and we need to actively, critically, analyze our beliefs about the world and about what it means to be human in a more than human world in order to see the world differently. But I argue in the book that really what I think is the most important piece, one of the most important pieces of this process, is telling new stories, to allow ourselves to become enchanted with the world that we live in and with other beings. Enchantment, this experience of enchantment, and incantare, to enter into the song of something. To be enchanted by something or someone is to come into contact with another mind. It's a meeting of beings. It's a meeting of minds. We experience, a spark of enchantment if you look into your dog or cat's eyes. If you pet them and they look at you, with this obvious sentient gaze, that can foster a moment of enchantment. We experience it when we fall in love. When we fall in love with someone and you have that first moment of recognizing, whoa, this is another human being with a whole universe, within them that I can touch, I can access, we can share our universes. That's enchanting. We were once very full of stories about the enchantment of nature and of non-human beings. Our spiritual traditions, our cultural traditions, our sense of identity, these were themselves constructed through our relationships with non-humans. They were an integral part of the establishment of our cultures. But now we think of them very differently. We've basically reduced all non-humans to resources and objects that can be utilized and instrumentalized by humans for whatever purpose, with utter, amorality, no concern for the morality of that. So I think stories are very important. I think enchanting stories, engaging with myth, with fairy tales, with fantasy. Ursula Le Guin, she once wrote that what fantasy can do that the realistic novel generally cannot do is include the non-human as essential. And I think that's a really important point. Because stories are really the way that we perceive the world, that we understand the world. Stories create the worlds that we live in. Your identity, your culture, your nation, our economy, all of these ideas that we have are ultimately narratives. They're stories. They're the kind of operating system that we download in order to be able to make sense of the world and to, have it make sense between people as well. So we need to tell new stories. But I also think that spiritual practice has a really important part to play in a most foundational way. And we could call these spiritual practices or spiritual exercises or philosophical exercises. It doesn't necessarily have to be religious or spiritual. It can be secular and yet also be a kind of spiritual exercise, because spirituality and practices, exercises, these are ways that we change our ways of living. They're ways that we can actively augment our day-to-day lives and the ways that we conduct ourselves, which ultimately impacts our values. Our values are formed by the ways that we live, and our morals are formed by our values. This was Nietzsche's idea, at least. So we have to sort of hack that system a little bit, because otherwise we're generally going to fall into the idea that our morals are right simply because we think they're right, but they come from our values, our pre-existing values, the ways that we live. So if you're used to living in a certain way, you are naturally going to start thinking that that is the moral way to live, simply because that's what is natural for you. That's what feels natural for you. It's very difficult for us to genuinely impact our morals. The way that we can do that is through enchantment, through spiritual practice, through relationship, through actually getting to know other people, other kinds of beings, generating, a heartfelt relationship with even a pet or a farm animal or a wild animal or what have you. That can change your entire perspective of the world, because you're allowing yourself to feel compassion for other minded sentient beings.
Yeah, absolutely. This really makes me think about feeding your demons, and so much of the practice we do in feeding your demons is to identify these parts of ourselves. And in feeding your demons, of course, we're looking at parts of our human experience. But I think the interesting crux is, like, how do you build a relationship with that part, and how do you personify it in a form? I'm curious if you could comment on that. Of we're talking about, of course, the very real unseen beings that we exist with, and feeding your demons is more about these parts of ourselves that are shadow or unrecognized. But like, what other parallels there? How do these bodies of work connect?
Yeah, so many things to potentially say. The book, I really, for Unseen Beings, one of the things that the book did for me was flesh out a sort of the other side of a bit of a fork in the road, which Machik actually leads us to. Machik explains that, the real gods and demons, or indeed the real gods and devils, are not some kind of scary, spooky creatures outside somewhere that are wandering around trying to compel us into, divinity or evil. They're not these archetypes, these external beings are not archetypes of good and evil. They're not absolute good gods that can take us to salvation, or ultimately evil devils that can take us to damnation. The real gods and demons, or, real gods and devils, matas, are within our own minds. The real demons are anything that hinder our experience of freedom, that block our experience of liberation. But I think, for a lot of people, they hear that and they think, oh, okay, she's saying that like ghosts and spirits and sort of external beings are just allegories, or they're just symbols. They're not really there. And that isn't true. That wasn't true for Machik. She was drawing a distinction here between external beings who are sentient beings. If you see a ghost, if you see a spirit, if you see a tree spirit or a water spirit, if you see a naga, yaksha, teorang, a gelpo, whatever, it's not that that's an allegory. It's just that it's not a god or a devil. It's not that they are absolute good or absolute evil. It's not that they're a source of refuge or a devilish, impish tempter that's going to take you into the lower realms. No one else can do that for us. It's up to us. The gods and demons are in our own minds, but other beings do in fact exist. Machik existed in an animistic world. She was teaching Buddhism to an animistic world and from an animistic perspective. One of the really interesting things about Tibetan Buddhism is that it went directly from very distinctly animistic traditions into the formal adoption of Buddhism. And there's a lot of animistic components in the Tibetan tradition, also in Buddhism from India and many other traditions, obviously across Asia. But this is, very prominent in Tibetan Buddhism and can be seen very clearly. And I think Machik really speaks to that orientation most lucidly, because chud is itself a kind of animistic process. You are engaging directly with unseen beings. You are engaging directly with beings that scare you, certainly, but it's not just about fear. It's, going to Nyensa, going to, these wild places, these sensitive places. It's not just about scaring yourself awake. It's also about going into spirited locations, enchanted locations, which are populated by other kinds of beings, especially properly unseen sort of nature spirits like the Lu and the Nyen and the Sadak, etc. So in her early texts also, she very rarely uses the term demons in the context of chud. She uses the term mimayin, non-humans. And that's a significant point in her system. She was very clearly adamant about her students not attempting to dominate or destroy or abuse or torture or wrathfully liberate unseen beings. Her advice was always to approach them with compassion, in the same way that we need to approach our own psyches. That mentality of feeding, not fighting, it does in fact apply on an external and internal level. And, even though we're talking about unseen beings in the sense of spirits and so on, this also very much applies to non-humans of all kinds. Our approach to other forms of life, to other sentient life forms who are in their own experience of reality, who are also aware and conscious on multiple levels, should be a relationship of compassion. So I think that Machik really illustrates this very beautifully. I talk about that in the book. I talk a bit about feeding your demons in the book. But yeah, I think her path, her approach is phenomenally inspiring for a lot of reasons. It's one of the most relational approaches that you find in Tibetan Buddhism. You're not just sitting in a big monastery with a bunch of other people, chanting, various texts and doing rituals and summoning demons so you can trap them in little boxes and stomp on them and bury them and, do all
create effigies and burn them and cut them in half.
Exactly. You obviously find some of these sorts of things in the Chud tradition, but a lot of this did in fact come after Machik's time. Her most obvious, or the teachings that can most reasonably be actually, applied to her, accredited to her. What's the word I'm looking for? It is ascribed to her. Thank you. These are really radically compassionate approaches to the world at large, to other kinds of beings, to other humans, to non-humans, and also to the nature spirits, the beings that embody or are embodied in the natural world. I think our perception of, in Buddhism, I talk a lot about plants in this book because modern research has made it incredibly clear just over the past 20, 30 years that plants are sentient beings. Plants are information processing organisms with multiple forms of consciousness, multiple sensory consciousnesses, as we would say in the Buddhist tradition. They have a sense of sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, and they have other forms of sensory awareness which aren't covered by our familiar ones, and yet we are the superior forms of life. They can also photosynthesize their nutrients by transforming light into nourishment, which is something that literally,
pretty wild.
Exactly. I mean, these are the kinds of things that, yogis attempt to do when doing like Chulen practice up in, in retreat or something. And yet we think that, we are the most evolved and that these aren't even beings to begin with. I talk about why that idea arose in Buddhism in the first place, because it was very much a pragmatic, I think, oversight of either the historical Buddha or those that sort of, helped to instate his traditions in the centuries that followed. But it's important that we see past that and recognize that at least all biological life forms are sentient. They have awareness. They have that fundamental ground of awareness upon which other forms of consciousness can arise. But also the ways in Buddhism that non-human spirits are related to is, I think, profoundly interesting and profoundly important, because we can't just stop at biological life. And spirit paradigms give us the ability to recognize that not only is a tree a sentient being, but also a forest is a kind of sentient being. We know this scientifically because through mycorrhizal networks underneath the forest floor, trees and other plants and fungi work together to create this kind of maha being that can share information across a vast network of different individual parts, much like our own neural structures as animals. And this gives us a language to be able to relate to that. A god of the forest, a spirit of the forest. We can understand, we can relate to that kind of being and understand that they are really embodied in the forest itself. Or, a being of the water. This has been in many indigenous traditions, especially in the Americas. The idea that water is life is not just an environmentalist slogan. That's a deep spiritual and philosophical, idea, and more than an idea, a kind of knowledge about the world. So to imagine that, there could be a spirit of a lake or the ocean or the water or a mountain or a tree or a forest, etc., that gives us the relational space to be able to actually enter into deep relationship and engagement with non-human beings and non-human environments in a much more personal way. We can actually generate compassion for them, which is phenomenally important, and a really, rich opportunity to completely change our relationship with so-called nature.
This makes my heart so happy to hear this, and to hear that there's things that we can do. That, because when I read the book, it's it's so much information. These ideas are magnificent to wrap your mind around. But then, what do we do? Like, how do we walk in the world and try and build these relationships with unseen beings to find enchantment in our day to day? And so what do we do?
Well, there's a handy chapter in the book which is essentially uses the Buddha's Eightfold Path as the basis for a method of treatment. The book is broken up into diagnosis, etiology, prognosis, and treatment. So sort of approaching it medically, what's our problem? Where does it come from? Also, what is the natural state? What is the state of health that we fell from? And I argue that state, when it comes to our relationship with the environment, is animism. An animistic orientation to the world at the most basic level. It's not a belief system. It's not a religion. It's not some sort of fixed dogma. It's a relational paradigm. It's the basic acknowledgement that other forms of life genuinely exist and that we are in relationship with them, and that is our place in the world as humans in a more than human world. We are in relationship with other beings. That doesn't mean that we can't look after our own welfare in our own ways, but to do so at the expense of even acknowledging the personhood or agency of other beings is sociopathic. That's not a legitimate system of philosophy and cosmology based in reality. That's just a sociopathic delusion. So understanding, what we came from, how we got into a state of disease, what the future holds for us, which isn't great, and then a sort of path of treatment. But I approach treatment not as a process of saving the world or saving nature or, fixing climate change. It's actually a process of recovery. And this is something that this language for me really comes from Tolkien, because he speaks of the three functions of myth, of genuine myth, fairy story, what he terms fairy story, which is escape, recovery, and consolation. Escape from the bondage of untrue ideologies, the shackles of a myopic worldview. It releases us from the prisons that we put ourselves in, and then recovery of a clear view, of a way of seeing the world not necessarily as it truly objectively is, but how we are meant to see it, how we are meant to engage with it. It doesn't mean that that's not truly how it is, but a clear view, the looking at the world anew, without the triteness of familiarity, which is itself the penalty of appropriation. creation, when we think we own things, when we think this is mine, I own this now, this is my property, it becomes familiar and trite and disenchanted, and we strip it of its agency. We make it an it instead of a they or a he or she or what have you as a person. So I view this as a process of recovery, which on one hand gives us the sense of the renewal of health, which is in fact what we're going for. We want to recover from our chronic and terminal disease of the Anthropocene, but we also need to recover a sense of a clear view, a sense of what it means to be human in a more than human world. We don't really need to double down and reify our dominance over non-human beings. We don't need more order. We don't need more progress in this very specific sense. From the European colonial perspective, which was a not good perspective, taking over entire continents, eradicating local populations, converting those that remain to Christianity, and changing the landscape and transforming it into material goods that can bring in wealth. That for them was progress. That the idea was that was progress. Taking nature and improving upon it and making it more valuable was perceived as progress. So when we now look at climate change and say, well, you know what we really need? We need a green revolution where we can just have green energy and green products, and we can have green this, green that, green this, green that, and everything can become absolutely just utopian, and we'll keep doing the same things. We'll keep capitalism, we'll keep consumerism, we'll keep these hierarchical power structures, we'll keep all of that, but we'll just do it a bit cleaner, and then we'll be fine. That's wrong. We need to recover. We need to recover. We need to fix what we have really messed up in some of our own human societies, our human philosophies, our human cultures, and we need to remember the more than human world. So that, like I said, this happens, I think, in multiple ways, through practices. Those are very useful, through engagement with myth, telling new stories, including absolutely works like Tolkien's. His work still is very much the mythic foundation of my life in a lot of ways. But it's not just him. There's many, forms of mythology. There's a great book, Matthew Hall, The Imagination of Plants, which is a book of botanical mythology, sentient plants and trees throughout history, including the Bodhi tree. So, there's a lot that we can do to tell new stories, to reimagine our orientation, our constellations that we form with non-human beings. And then we have this, Noble Eightfold Path, which for the Buddha was the treatment for suffering. The Four Noble Truths are this kind of process. It's a medical process. It's a diagnosis, an assessment of etiology, a prognosis, and a treatment. And for him, the Eightfold Path was the path to recovery. It was the course of treatment, focusing not only on, our beliefs and our practices and, whether we're good religious people or good, studious Buddhists or what have you, but really about our relations with others, the ways that we act in the world, that we speak in the world, that we, engage in processes, become mindful of the world, the ways we make our livelihood and so on. So I talk about different sort of methods within that context in the book, ranging from finding new ways to speak about animals and plants so that we're not calling them its, with this, very objectifying language, embracing non-human personhood, engaging, with practices that generate compassion and love and care, genuine care for non-human beings, instead of just assigning, moral systems onto our relationships with the world. So there's a lot there. I hope people read it and find it as interesting as I found it in researching and writing it. This book is really, it's changed my life a lot. I didn't expect this to be my first book. I expected to write something on, Tibetan medicine and herbalism or something like that. But it's all in there. It all fed into this. This was sort of the end result, I suppose, at this point, and also a jumping off point.
Yeah, I'm excited to read it again. I'm hoping my copy arrives any day now, and I can
People have been getting them today. It comes out on Tuesday, but people have been getting it in the mail today, which is crazy. It's very surreal.
Yes, I think May 30th is the official launch date, but it's some copies are out there.
Yeah,
depending on the shipping system. I believe you have a meditation for us, correct? Because I'm excited to try this and to dig in.
Yeah, so I think looking at there's comments in here that I would actually really like to get to. So I think the best thing to do, and anyone can feel free to veto this, is to do a short little meditation right now, and then after the meditation, I can look at some of the comments because there are some really good questions that I do want to look at.
Let's do that.
So if that works for everyone, great. If not, just let me know and we won't do it. Okay. So everyone. This practice, I'm tentatively calling this green Tonglen, but that name will not stick, so please don't quote me on it. But I would really started questioning, how can we adapt specifically the generation of aspirational bodhicitta, which is the work that we need to do right now, changing the way that we feel, that we see the world and the beings around us, before we step out onto the path as actors, as bodhisattvas in action. We need to generate the right sort of state of mind, the right orientation to these beings. So really thinking about loving kindness and compassion and sympathetic joy and equanimity in relation to non-humans, but really specifically to those that I feel have been most neglected in especially Buddhist circles, not especially Buddhist circles, in Buddhist circles, but more generally in religion, and in many different philosophical and scientific traditions. And these are plants. So in general, I think that we can do a great deal to increase our sense of loving kindness towards non-humans who are simply existing in their own natural state, without feeling that we need to disrupt them, without feeling that we need to alter them or improve upon them. We can generate greater compassion, sort of eco-compassion, by genuinely allowing ourselves to experience grief and concern, and empathy for those who are being exploited, being willing to help those in need, but also allowing ourselves to understand the grief and pain that they encounter, including very much animals who are very frequently just kind of pushed to the side, I think, in a lot of circles. I think especially in Tibetan Buddhism, unfortunately, even though we talk about them, there is very rarely a deep acknowledgement of the actual exploitation and pain that we put them through on a very regular basis. But that's a sort of different conversation. But also for plants, I'll talk about that in a minute. Sympathetic joy for nature's flourishing, allowing ourselves to be overjoyed with the beauty of nature without feeling that we need to claim it or appropriate it or own it. And equanimity, allowing ourselves to, really feel that we don't need to establish a master identity. We don't need to assign hierarchies to beings. We don't need to try to find a way to figure out who's better or worse, who's more intelligent, more evolved, who's less intelligent, less evolved, etc. But to basically recognize that all aware sentient beings are equally valuable on a fundamental intrinsic level. So in this sort of spirit, we of course practically in Tibetan Buddhism have Tonglen as the practice of giving and receiving. And we can extend that same practice, that same classical practice, to all of these beings that we've been talking about. Machik herself, she has a Tonglen practice in the rain summoning ritual in the Rinchen Trengwa, which is a very interesting practice for spirits. It's really centered around doing Tonglen for the Lu and the Nyen and the Sadak, etc. But we can also do this for animals. We can do this for plants. When we see a forest being burned or trees being chopped down, or any kind of living beings being disrupted and harmed, we can do this Tonglen practice. But the practice that I'm going to lead folks through right now, just very short, briefly, is a kind of green Tonglen, really focusing specifically on plants. When we think of nature, we are often thinking about plant-dominated landscapes. We tend to think that plants comprise nature. They're sort of the background scenery. Animals are kind of like props or set pieces. Sorry about that noise, moving around nature. But we think that humans are ultimately just beings that we visit nature once in a while. We don't recognize that we are also animals that are a part of this thing that we call nature. So this meditation, this is essentially an adaptation of Tonglen, but really specifically for the vegetal biosphere. And it's a practice of noticing, not of contriving, because in fact, there is nothing that we need to do in order to begin this process. It is naturally occurring with every single breath that we take. We are constantly in relationship with plants. We are helping to create, to really terraform the world for their benefit, just as they terraform the world for our benefit as animals. This practice is also, I would say, more closely associated with the generation of loving kindness, metta, than compassion per se. It's intended to bring us into a deeper sense of embodied presence within a plant-filled world, in relationship with those beings. So begin by just closing your eyes. And if you do this on your own, you can begin it in any way that you see fit, per your own traditions and customs. You can begin by going for refuge, for instance, but then be sure to generate a heartfelt motivation to engage in this process for the benefit of all beings, really specifically turning your mind towards plants, their allies and guardians, and the unseen beings that help to make up our natural world. So as you breathe in, and you can do this in a natural landscape around trees. If you have a house plant, I found that it's actually quite lovely to do it with the house plant in front of you, or in their presence, to really have an actual plant with you that you can engage with. So as you breathe in through your nose, just imagine that the air that's coming in is vibrant green in color. It's luminescent, full of all of the natural vitality of the plant world. And as it enters your lungs, imagine that the purest essence of the elements permeate every cell of your body. Your entire body is filled with the freshness of life. And as you breathe out, imagine that bright red light radiates out to all the trees, all the plants, and other organisms around you. And imagine that they absorb this light, and it fills them and their vegetal environments with sustenance and bliss. So breathing in this pure, vibrant, luminescent green light, it fills our bodies with vitality, and we exhale red light, which fills the trees and plants with vitality and sustenance and bliss. Just do this for a few moments, remembering that even if you don't have a plant in front of you, this process is in fact happening in every breath that you take. And if you are doing this practice in the presence of plants, see if you notice any fragrances, any qualities in the air. And as those fill your senses, contemplate how these smells are now a part of you, a part of your experience. Notice how they make you feel. If any positive feelings arise, allow those to radiate out on your exhalation, sharing your experience with the plants themselves. And with this, you can begin small. Again, you can start with a simple house plant, but then gradually expand your visualization to include all the plants in your surroundings and in your neighborhood, in your town, your region, your country, and on the whole of the earth. Imagine that all plant life becomes radiant and suffused with vitality. And from that vitality, then spreads to animals and fungi and microbes and all forms of life. And just repeat this process, spend as long as you'd like doing it. And if any distractions arise, then of course, just return to the breath. And once you've finished, be sure to dedicate any merit or positive experiences cultivated in this meditation towards the benefit of all beings, especially our plant friends. Just do that quietly right now. Thank you all. A couple of points on that. One is just recognizing the slight distinction here between this practice and Tonglen proper, where we in this approach, in this specific practice, we're not necessarily taking in the suffering of others and replacing it with compassion or with joy and bliss and so on. That can be a part of it. That is Tonglen proper. So if you want to do that practice in the presence of animals or plants who might be experiencing suffering, then Tonglen is the right practice for that. But this practice is really designed to remind us of our interdependence with non-human beings, especially in the plant world, to allow ourselves to see them, to bring them out of the background and into the foreground. It's also, I think, important for it to really be embodied. You don't need to imagine that your body is, a balloon of light or crystal or perfectly clear, that there's no organs in there. Our embodiment is important. Our separation from our sense of embodiment, from our own animal bodies, is itself part of the problem. It's part of what helps to cement this separation, this perceived gap between being human and being non-human. So in every opportunity you get, remember, this is an animal body. We are living in an animal body. It is natural. It is nature. We are a part of this earth. We arise from this earth. And I hope that practices like this can help us to feel that more deeply. Okay, so I know this is a bit longer than an hour, but I want to get to these comments. So for anyone that wants to stick around for that, please feel free to do so. I won't do all of them, but the questions that come up, I want to answer them for you. So thanks for sending these in. Looks like the first question that comes up is, how do you feel about cut flowers? If they are sentient, is it inauspicious to buy cut flowers? Yeah, so plants, their relationship with embodiment is quite different from animal embodiment. Our relationship with our bodies are such that if you chop off any part of them, it's usually not going to end well. That's usually a very extreme thing to occur to an animal. There's some animals that can regrow limbs. We can't. We can grow a little bit of extra flesh in some cases, but we can't grow new limbs. And if you cut us in half, we will die. But for a lot of plants, for most plants, this isn't the case. The experience of being a plant is very different. Their experience of consciousness, their sensory awareness, their ability to transform sensory input into behavior is a much more diffused process. In a lot of cases, if you take a cutting from a plant and you plant it in a pot with some soil and you treat it well, you then have two plants, and those are two sentient beings. Those are then two living, intelligent organisms who are experiencing their world, who are aware of what's happening to them, and who will then live their lives in their own plant ways. That's very bizarre for us because we imagine reproduction in very different terms. But for most of the biological world, reproduction isn't necessarily a strict consequence of sex. It can occur in many other ways. So and something to remember with plants. Plants are also very much root-centered. Most plants, their vitality is really in their roots. Some plants, like grasses, for instance, they actually grow from the tips, not from the roots, so that when animals graze on them, that doesn't hurt them at all. That's actually what they are designed, not by someone necessarily, but that's what they are designed to do. That's how their bodies work. It's that relationship between plants in their bodies and animals in their bodies is a really important consideration when we start to accept plants as sentient beings, because then obviously a lot of moral and ethical conundrums arise, and we start to worry about things like cutting flowers or even eating plants. But plants, they have evolved to be eaten. It is in their benefit in many cases to have parts of their bodies eaten. It isn't necessarily to their benefit to have their roots destroyed. It isn't necessarily beneficial for a tree to just cut them down. That is traumatic, and that is often a form of killing in a very literal sense. But for a lot of other plants, you can cut off a flower, which is simply a kind of external organ that they express temporarily, and that isn't necessarily going to kill the plant. So it's a different dynamic. I talk about this in the book, so definitely check it out, because these are important questions to ask. You might see this question and think like, oh, Like, that's ridiculous. We shouldn't even be asking that. Those are precisely the questions that we need to start asking, to really consider the impact of our behaviors on others. This was very prominent in the Jain tradition, which was somewhat contemporary with Buddhism. It came a bit before Buddhism. But the founder of Jainism considered plants to be at least single sensory organisms with consciousness, and therefore to kill them, to cause them harm and suffering, was also a form of violence. Buddhism didn't accept that. There is evidence that the Buddha did in fact believe that, but it wasn't instated as a moral paradigm within Buddhism. But yeah, that's talked about in the book. I think the best way for us to approach it is to cause as little suffering as possible, whenever possible. So flowers can be a lovely thing to cut. Maybe don't take a lot of them. Allow some flowers to still be there. Don't kill an entire plant if you don't have to, just for the flowers. There's a lot of considerations like that that are on a very case-by-case basis. Yeah, there's lovely comment here about being guided and protected by deities from ancient cultures, near-death experience. Fortunately, the farming culture into which this person was born has great respect for and interest in all the living beings who support human existence, not just by feeding us. Yeah, not Val Plumwood. No, it is Val Plumwood. She makes a great point that, animals are food and also more than food. And we are also food and more than food. From a crocodile's perspective, a human being is also food. Once a human dies, once we're buried in the earth, as long as we're not sealed in a lead coffin or cremated, if we are returned to the land, then we are consumed. We are food for the earth and for other beings. And we are also more than food, in the same way that animals are food in many cases for many beings, and also much more than food. They are also beings, they're persons. Old relationships, ancient relationships, prehistoric relationships, also just non-modern and non-Western relationships with animals tend to be very different. Traditional hunting societies, indigenous peoples from many different places have had very different relationships with animals, even the animals that they hunt, recognizing that they are in relationship with them. Even if they hunt them, even if they commit violence towards them, they recognize it as violence towards or between living beings, not a mere process of exploiting resources, which is the way that we tend to view it. Nice to know that there's folks writing these sorts of things for their thesis. Yeah, good question here about precious human birth. I don't think it's a reasonable paradigm, personally. This is my personal opinion. The 6 realms itself, which were originally 5 realms, and Tsongkhapa really standardized the 6 realms, breaking up the devas and asuras. Also, you can read about this in the book. But the idea that humans are the only ones that can attain liberation is demonstrably false. There are many, many, many instances in the sutras, in other texts, in which non-human beings of many kinds, including spirits, including devas and asuras, etc., attain at least some degree of attainment, and they can become great teachers. They can become great accomplished practitioners, guardians of the Dharma, exponents of the Dharma, expounders of the Dharma. So I think this idea is probably quite reductive. The very idea that animals are ignorant and that's all they are, that the animal realm is predominated by ignorance, the God realm by desire or by pride, the hungry ghost realm by desire, the asuras by jealousy, etc. The mere idea that all non-human animals, from apes to mosquitoes, are just purely a manifestation of ignorance, I think is itself quite ignorant and quite misguided. And the idea that humans are the only ones that can attain liberation, I find to be really problematic, especially when we consider the fact that, it's actually, I know I'm going way over, sorry everyone. In the Japanese tradition, there are a number of really important Buddhist systematizers that really questioned whether or not plants are actually already enlightened. Some considered the possibility that plants are sentient beings, but others considered whether plants are actually enlightened beings, looking at the ways that they live their lives. Like I said earlier, literally photosynthesizing nutrients from light itself, not claiming life in order to exist, but just transforming light into life. And it's, I don't think any mistake or any coincidence that the Buddha and Mahavira, founder of Jainism, they both sought liberation under a tree. And for many years in Buddhism, the Bodhi tree itself, themselves, was actually a stand-in for the Buddha in iconographic depictions of him. So there's a lot to unpack there, but essentially, I think that the human life is precious. I don't think that it's necessarily fundamentally more precious than other forms of life. Breaking down master identity, taxonomy, and hierarchies. How do we best move forward? It seems we are amidst a polarity of those who care and believe in making positive healing shifts forward, and those who are furious, rebellious, angry, and denial, and those who are just simply trying to survive and innocently, unintentionally caught up in destructive lifestyles. I don't know, but I'm deeply appreciating this conversation. Yeah, I really appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, these are kinds of conversations that I hope can begin with the contents of the book, especially the final chapters. Really, you know, questioning how can we start to move forward in these ways. We have to remember that it's not necessarily that we need to do a lot more, and it's not that we are going to radically change the entire world and enter into some kind of utopia. Our worlds that we've created over the past, really, especially 500 years, but more generally past couple thousand years, are crumbling. They are crumbling. They are falling. We are experiencing one of many apocalypses that have occurred across many different societies. It's not a new thing. European societies have themselves created apocalypses for countless indigenous peoples across the world. But we are now experiencing a kind of ending of the system that we've created. It is crumbling. And we can't try to put up the stops and keep it up, because it has itself been an incredibly oppressive institution. It's important that it does transform into something else. But what we can do is allow for new life to grow from the cracks. We can focus on cultivating a life worth living, first and foremost, for ourselves and for those around us, and have that be our focus. We can focus on living well, but not necessarily better than those who came before. We have to let go of this idea that we have to constantly get more and more powerful, more and more control, and that someday we'll just be able to fix everything. So focus on our own lives, focus on the stories we tell ourselves, focus on our own experiences of enchantment, spend some time outside, spend some time getting to know some trees and some animals and some plants and some fungi. You know, really enter back into the living world. Allow yourself to feel yourself in it. Enter deeper into your own sense of embodiment, and just focus on that for now. But there's a lot more to talk about in the book. AI, yeah. Yeah, the AI ethicists. I know some folks that have been working with some of these AI ethicists, actually. There's a lot of interesting questions being had there. And I do certainly think that I'm not someone who would immediately say, oh, it's a machine. It can't possibly be sentient, or it can't, approach sentience. I don't know. This is a fascinating moment for humanity, but I'm very, very, very concerned that we are having those conversations in a climate, in a context in which we are not even beginning to publicly, widely address the sentience of non-human animals and non-human beings by and large. Just because it's too inconvenient to our systemic exploitation of them. More about AI. I don't think I'm gonna go down that road. Yeah, I think that Cartesian, yes, I talk about Rene Descartes in this. I wish I talked more about Carl Linnaeus, because he was also a very important figure, scientific figure, in creating our dominant sort of ontology, this idea of breaking everyone up into species. And once you have a species identified, then you can know everything about every single member of that species, this sort of collapsing of categories into almost archetypes. This is the mentality behind lab rats, thinking that if you put a rat, a living being with a living sense of their lives and their circumstances, into a very oppressive situation, and you test them and do terrible things to them, that you'll learn something about rats in the wild, or that you'll learn something about all rats. And that often isn't the case. We are all individuals. None of us can be collapsed or reduced to simply one of the identifiers that are used to categorize us. Yeah, someone said, yesterday I stood in the forest with deer and witnessed with love and fascination a microcosmic insect creature creeping and carrying up a tree. And then after a drive to bring my son to work town, I passed a woman standing on street selling roses, each wrapped with plastic, with a sign saying that she has 4 children to feed. I'm not sure where that was going, but great. Yeah, I mean, those little moments those little moments, especially when you get the stark sort of disparity between the world that we've created that we think is so progressive and wonderful and so advanced and so much better than everything that came before, which often isn't, versus the wonders of the world as it is. You know, when you really come face to face with even the tiniest insect and you observe them and you watch them and you try to imagine what it would be like to be them, that is when enchantment strikes. That's when you have that moment of awe, which brings you into an experience of compassion. It's a powerful moment when we have those little glimpses. I'm so glad everyone's copies are coming soon. Curious about alchemy. Yeah, so am I. But I don't talk about it as much in the book, but I do talk about alchemy quite a bit in other places. Yeah, this is great. Thank you, everyone. The link for the book is posted. It should be in here somewhere. If you go to unseen-beings.com, you can find a bunch of links to order in a place near you. It's being published across the world, so you can find it just about anywhere. And obviously all the big major book retailers are carrying it so that you can get it there. I think that's it. Sorry for keeping everyone over for a half hour, but I hope it was interesting. Thank you for joining. And thank you so much to Anna for being here.
Yeah.
Honestly, such a joy to chat with you. And thanks.
My absolute pleasure. My goodness. What a fun way to spend a Sunday.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think we can just end it here. Thank you so much, Erik Jampa. Everyone, if you're here, please order the book or like borrow it from a friend or come find it. I just read it and I'm really excited to read it again. So if that's any endorsement.
Thank you very much. And thanks, Lama Tsultrim, for having me on here, having us do this. I really appreciate it. And thank you for your support. Lama Tsultrim was one of the first people to read the finished book. Yeah, I'm very fortunate to have an endorsement from her on the back cover, which I actually don't know if she's seen. I think she has a physical copy, but yeah, and she's on the very first page, which is very apropos. So yeah, thank you everyone for your support and for sticking with me through this process. I will be doing a lot more of these kinds of things in the future, more retreats and workshops and online programs and on-site programs. So I hope to see some folks in the future.
Yay.
Cool.
Thank you so much for being with us today, Erik Jampa and Anna. A really special thank you to Erik for sharing your valuable insights and offering us a glimpse into this transformative power of your upcoming book. That was just great. And a heartfelt appreciation to Anna for guiding us through an engaging and thought-provoking interview. Thank you so much. And of course, I extend our deepest gratitude to Lama Tsultrim Allione for joining us today and embracing us with her beautiful opening and for creating this inspirational space that opens our hearts to new perspectives. And to you, all our viewers around the world, your presence always makes this event truly special, no matter if you connect live or through a recording of this event. We hope you leave today with renewed inspiration. By the way, you are warmly invited to join us next Sunday, June 4th, for a special Global Sangha Practice Day on one of the most revered and important days in the Vajrayana tradition called Sagadawa Duchen, a day commemorating the birth, enlightenment, and parinirvana of the Buddha Shakyamuni, when our merits are multiplied 100,000 times. So please do join us at 10 a.m. Mountain Daylight Time. It will be exactly like at the same time as Lama Live, for a Sangha-wide Green Tara practice honoring this sacred day that will be led by Lama Tsultrim's son, Tulku Osel Dorje. This virtual event is open to all. There is no registration required. And if this practice is new to you, you are welcome to join and receive the blessings of it. And also, please mark your calendars that on June 18th, Lama Tsultrim's guest on Lama Life will be Dick Schwartz, who is a systemic family therapist, author and creator of the internal family systems branch of therapy. And then on June 25th, we will have Wendy Garling, a writer, independent scholar, and authorized Dharma teacher. She's the author of Stars at Dawn, Forgotten Stories of Women in the Buddha's Life, and The Woman Who Raised the Buddha, The Extraordinary Life of Mahaprajapati. Wendy will be interviewed by a Taramandala senior teacher, Polly Ryan. Thank you so much, everyone. It was a very exciting gathering today. May we meet again and again on the path, and may all beings benefit everywhere.
Om tare tu re, Mangalam Shri Mahapani Swaha. Om tare tu re, Mangalam Shri Mahapani Swaha. Om tare tu re, Mangalam Shri Mahapani Swaha. Om tare tu